This talk is my personal take on explaining humanism, and yours may be a bit different, but I hope you at least find some of it helpful. Um, when giving a talk, I'm often reminded of the title of my namesake's book, which was Notes on Nursing: What it is, and What it is not. And I'm going to be talking about humanism, what it is, and what it is not. So my kids asked me, is humanism a thing? I'm not entirely sure what they meant by that, but they also said, is humanism as a religion? And nowadays, we say that humanism is a worldview, and worldviews can be religious or non-religious. And you'll recognize those ones on the left, and on the right, the only one of those that really plays a part at the moment is humanism. Now, it's a little bit more complicated because there is a sort of grey area in the middle. Some of these religions um, have groups within them that are non-theist. They don't actually believe in God. So you might have Quakers who believe in Quaker values and the Quaker way of life, but don't necessarily believe the supernatural. And of course, we have Jews who consider themselves to be racially Jewish or ethnically Jewish, but don't believe the supernatural elements of Judaism. It's less common in Islam because apostasy has a great stigma, both in communities and sometimes countries, and can sometimes be dangerous. There are a number of countries in the world where apostasy and leaving Islam actually has the death sentence. So, what is a worldview? Well, if you look for a definition, the best thing is to go to the Equality Act, and they looked at 9 protected characteristics, and one of them was religion or belief. And this is how they defined it. They said, um, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just put up that. It sums it up a bit better. It must be genuine, and that's to say, not the Jedi Knights or something like that. It can't just be a single opinion like Brexit. And it has to be weighty and substantial, cogent and serious, and cohesive and important. And that means it's really got to have some relationship not just to how one lives, but what life's about, the meaning of life, and other issues as well. And it has to be reasonably dignified and decent. So if you think about it, atheism, agnosticism, liberalism, that's a belief in a liberal democracy, or veganism, these are all one issue beliefs that really don't constitute a religion. I don't think they should. So, um, when is a worldview religious or non-religious? Well, you'd think it was easy, but there isn't actually any single defining characteristic to determine whether a worldview is religious or not. It's probably easier to look at what Wittgenstein called a family resemblance. And for that reason, if you say, look at religions, the majority of them, but not all, have belief in one or more gods and an afterlife, heaven, hell, purgatory, or reincarnation. They usually have sacred texts, the Bible, the Quran, the Talmud, the Hindu Vedas, and they usually have um, rules and doctrines, sometimes actually written literally carved in stone. And they have a prescribed pattern of worship, and they have a founding figure who's always male. And they have leaders who are popes, and priests, and rabbis, and imams. In previous times, they were exclusively male. And some people consider that maybe religions were invented by men for men, and that's certainly possible. So I would encourage you to use the term religious and non-religious worldviews. unfortunately, some people have a shorthand and they refer to religions and worldviews, although religions are worldviews. And worse still, some people say religions and beliefs, which is a bit awkward because it leads some people to think that maybe humanism isn't included. So I would encourage you to stick with religious and non-religious worldviews. The next question is, who is religious? Well, sociologists have four main criteria to decide whether a person is religious. The first is loose cultural affiliation. By this criteria, I'm a Christian because I love churches and cathedrals. I love Christian music and Christian art, but I do not feel I belong to a religion. And I do not believe in the core tenets. I do not believe in the virgin birth and the miracles, let alone God and the divinity of Jesus. And nor do I practice. I don't go to church or undertake actions like that. So sociologists, when they are doing surveys of religion, they quite rightly exclude loose cultural affiliation, and they concentrate on belonging, believing, and behaving. So let's look at some figures. So this is the number of people who consider they belong to a particular worldview. And this is over the last 25 years. So you can see that the Christians have fallen steadily, and at the same rate, the non-religious has increased. The proportion of non-Christian religions has not really changed very much. So 53% of the current population have no religion. And among young people, it's 72%. Now, if you think of our established faith, the Church of England, the church that has bishops in the House of Lords and runs a large number of our state schools, only 12% of the population say they're Church of England, and among young people, it's only 1%. And these are very powerful statistics. There's no doubt about this. You may find some people challenge you. I had a vicar who said everybody he knows is Christian. Well, yeah, that's not a very good sample, really. So you do need to have your references, and most of these come from that, a very reliable source. So living without religion is common, 53% overall, 72% of young people. But one thing's very interesting, is that of the people who say they belong to the Christian faith, they are Christians, less than half believe that Jesus was a real person, died, came back to life, and was a son of God, which is the sine qua non. This is almost the defining beliefs for being a Christian. And I think that's quite interesting. So many of them are probably not, they're not believing Christians, certainly. And another interesting fact is that most of those without religion, the 53%, hold basic humanist values. If you say to them, what do you believe? They say, well, I don't believe anything, meaning they don't have a religion. But if you actually ask them what they believe about the world and about human beings, their views most commonly are humanist. Okay, so explaining humanism. Well, it does depend who you're talking to. Now, some religious people, like Yogesh, are very receptive and interested in other faiths, including humanism. But some are very antagonistic and defensive, and some of them, in fact, refuse to talk to anybody outside their own faith. Humanists, well, I'm talking to humanists tonight. Humanists are only 5% of the population, but probably 2/3 of all the non-religious people. Humanists come in different shapes and sizes. One big difference is between happy humanists and angry atheists. And I'll give you an example. Now, for those of you who can't remember the 60s, either because you're too young or you're taking too much drugs, for those of you who can't remember, everybody had long hair back then. So back in my late teens, I changed. Prior to that, I'd been pretty devout Christian, was planning to follow my brother into the church. I believed the whole shebang. And then I saw the light and I became an angry atheist. And I was unhappy. And I was unhappy because I felt as though I'd been misled and brainwashed. I felt guilty. And the reason I felt guilty was that God knew what I was doing, everything. And he knew what I was thinking. He could look into my teenage brain, which was a pretty murky place back then. On the other hand, when I lost my faith, I actually missed religion. I was upset there wasn't a God. There was no alternative offered. I had never heard of anybody else leaving religion apart from Bertrand Russell and his book Why I'm Not a Christian, which isn't actually a great deal of help. And of course, it's not surprising the prayers I offered weren't answered, and I didn't know how to answer right and wrong and so on. So I was actually an unhappy atheist. And I was a sort of atheist that went around telling people with religious faith that everything they thought was important and meaningful in their lives was a load of rubbish. And these people, on the whole, were much nicer and much happier than I was. I feel terribly embarrassed looking back on it. But thanks to them and their forbearance, we remain friends, including my brother. And then about, I don't know how many years ago, I went to a humanist funeral and was knocked out. It was so wonderful. So I decided to find out about humanism. And then I changed. I became a happy humanist, not an angry atheist. And my attitude to religion changed. Um, I realized that people with faith saw their religion making them happier person and a better person. They saw the same in their families and their communities. You know, what's not to like? It's just that I felt I could achieve the same without religion. Okay, then there are the non-humanist, non-religious, that are unaligned non-religious, the atheists, agnostics, and the don't knows. And then you have the interfaith groups. Now, normal interfaith forums are great fun. The people who attend them are interested and interesting and keen to learn about other people. Some interfaith committees, like Sacre, are a little different. It's not uncommon for people to have their own agenda about promoting their own religion, particularly the Christians, and sometimes at the expense of humanists. The other thing you have to consider when you're deciding to explain humanism is why. Why are you explaining it? What are you trying to achieve? And let's just run through some examples. Firstly, are you talking to inform humanists? Well, obviously, that's exactly what I'm doing today. Are you trying to convert the faithful? Well, from my point of view, I would give a resounding no. The reason being that I don't think we're in the business of converting people. If people are happy in their religion, leave them be. Everybody has a right to believe whatever they like. Everybody actually has a right in a free and open society to do and say whatever they like with one big proviso, and that is they do no harm. It's the harm we're against, not their doctrine. But of course, we're all against harm done by religious people, harm done by non-religious people, harm done by humanists. It's the harm we're against, not the doctrine. What about talking to help people leave religion? Well, I would sort of do a bit of a yes and a no here. I don't think we're trying to help them leave religion, but some people benefit who are trying to leave, particularly a coercive, inclusive religion. They become very distressed, and it helps them to be contacted by organizations like Faith to Faithless. What about to convert the non-religious? Well, I say I'm not very keen myself on conversion, but the thing about the unaligned non-religious, people who are non-religious but don't call themselves humanists, is that um, is that when you tell them about humanism, when you tell them about what we believe, they most commonly say, well, I think I've always been a humanist. So we lay our wares out before them, and many of them then identify as humanists, or at least they have a name to put to their philosophical beliefs, even if they don't want to call themselves a humanist or join. So a bit of yes and no. To inform the faithful, yes, and to promote uh, and also get rid of their myths about humanism and to promote humanist campaign, absolutely. Okay, so the next thing you have to decide is how long you've got. So I've done quite a lot of radio over the last few years, and it sounds a bit scary, but it's not. Um, if you're well prepared, it's not that difficult, and the interviewer is usually very helpful. All they really want is good radio for their listeners. They're not going to give you a hard time. Um, Often you get a phone call from the producer of the program asking you to comment as a humanist, from a humanist point of view, about some issue, which might be um, humanist weddings or celebrating Christmas and things like that. Sometimes they'll offer you a choice between a recorded interview and a live one. Now, you might think the recorded one is not so scary, but actually, it's not very good because if you do fluff it and ask them if you could do it again, they usually say, no, no, that was fine. We can use that. And the other thing is, they have an opportunity of editing it, and sometimes they take out your killer punchline. Okay, what you do need to do if you're asked to speak on the radio is to speak, if you can, to the producer to find out what they have in mind and also roughly how long you've got to talk, because it's a nightmare if while you're talking, they interrupt and say, oh, thank you, Mr. Nightingale. Now for the football results. And you haven't given your killer punchline. So, for example, if I'm talking on Shropshire Radio about an upcoming talk we're giving that's of public interest, I need to get in the details about the talk at the beginning. And then what I also do, I have a card with all the details printed on, which I hand to the interviewer and ask him to repeat them later on in the program. Okay, so what they quite often do, if you're talking about, faith schools or something like that, they'll say, right, so you're a humanist. Could you tell us what that is? So you've got to have something short and punchy. So I'll spend a couple of minutes or a few minutes talking about that. So now there we are in the studio. So firstly, avoid um, saying what you don't believe and avoid saying things you're against. Don't start off by having a rant about faith schools. And whatever you do, do not ridicule or make jokes about anything religious. They can be very funny jokes, but it puts us in a very bad light. And also remember not to make generalizations. Don't say all Hindus are such and such, or all Jews believe this, that, and the other. That's seldom true, and it's offensive. So the soundbite I used to use was humanists believe that you can lead a good life and be a good person without religion. And I sort of like this because, it's straight off, it said good life, good person, no religion. And I thought that was quite good. In fact, this fairly innocuous looking sentence begs many other questions. For example, I say, I believe all this, but what evidence do I have? I say, I can lead a good life. But what is a good life? And that takes us back to Aristotle and eudaimonia. I say I can be a good person, but how do I know what is good and bad without a Bible? And I say I can do all this without religion, but isn't humanism just another religion? And anyway, even if this is true, what do humanists actually do? Now, actually, when I'm talking in schools, I actually put this up and then encourage them to question these things. We deal with each of them in turn. There is a problem with this soundbite, and that is that it's defining humanism as not religious. I mean, does that mean if there weren't any religions, there'd be no humanism? Interesting thought. So I changed. I accentuate the positive. And for example, I'll say, the world is best understood by natural laws and natural forces. Okay, that's the philosophical position of naturalism. We can work out what's right and wrong and good and bad for ourselves. And the meaning of life can be found in the way we lead our lives. But then, of course, some religious persons say, well, yeah, I mean, I believe all that. Yes, that seems fairly straightforward. So sometimes you do have to point out that, I should just mention, these three questions are actually quite interesting. How do we know stuff? How should we behave? And what's it all about? And for those of you with an interest in philosophy, you'll recognize that we have terms for these, epistemology, normative ethics, and metaphysics. So if you had to explain to somebody why a religious person wouldn't conform to this, the world is best understood by natural laws and forces rather than the supernatural or superstition. We can work out what's right and wrong and good and bad for ourselves without the need for sacred texts or priests to interpret them. The meaning of life can be found in the way we lead our lives, not in something or someone out there somewhere. I've got another problem, though. Humanists believe, that's a bit off, really. It implies that you have to believe these things to be a humanist. It implies we almost have a catechism. And that doesn't look good. I don't think it's true either. So I change it now. I say, as a humanist, I believe these things. And that is sort of my current soundbite. And you usually get that in before they want to tell you about the football results. Okay, so what about if you've got a few minutes to explain things a little bit longer? Now, I'll give you an example of this. A few years ago, I was part of a multi-faith panel at this secondary school in Telford. There was a Baha'i, a Pentecostal Christian, a humanist, a Jew, and a Muslim. And obviously, I was the humanist. And we were asked to give a 2-minute account of our worldview. And the others really didn't do it very well. They whittled on about all being nice and kind and a bit about their leader and a bit about their festivals. And it was pretty incoherent, really, and not very helpful. So what I did was I thought about it. 2 minutes. Okay. It's got to be for sixth formers. It's got to be, I believe, personal, not didactic. I've got to accentuate the positive. But in this particular context, I do have to distinguish between humanism and religious worldviews. But I mustn't be anti-religious. And I can turn it into a handout with useful links. So I'll read you what I say. 2 minutes. You can look at it as well if you want. So this is what I say. I'm a humanist. What does that mean? What do I believe? In a nutshell, as a humanist, I believe I can have a good life and be a good person without belief in supernatural, gods, ghosts, and ghouls. As a humanist, I obtain knowledge from studying the way we are and the world about us. That means I believe in evolution rather than creationism, science rather than mystery, natural laws and forces rather than the supernatural, reason rather than superstition, understanding rather than prejudice. As a humanist, I believe that human morality, knowing right from wrong, comes from us, not some ultimate source of truth out there that we have to discover. Morality is partly something we're born with and partly something we work out for ourselves. That's called normative ethics and has been around since the ancient Greeks. I don't have a holy book like the Christian Bible or the Muslim Quran. I feel that a philosophy based on knowledge and reason and empathy is preferable to a theology based on divine revelation or holy books written hundreds or thousands of years ago. Having said that, the values that humanists arrive at are not so different from the values of many moderate religions. We value compassion and fairness and respect for human rights. Although I live with that religion, I'm not against religion, and I respect I'm not against religion, and indeed, humanists fight for the rights of everyone to believe what they want, and as long as they do no harm, to live how they want. I have a sense of awe and wonder as I contemplate the incredible world about me, but as I only have the one life, I know that I must live it well and help others to do the same. I find meaning and value in the way I live. Recent surveys have shown that over half the population of the UK live without religion. And though not all calling themselves humanists, the majority believe what humanists believes. Among school leavers aged 18 to 24, almost 3/4 will live without religion. And that is why humanism is taught alongside other worldviews in RE lessons. So that's the 2-minute version. For some years, Shropshire Radio had a Sunday morning religious program which they had a pause for thought, or you might call it like a thought for the day. And 4 times a year, I was asked to come and talk about humanism. And what I did was, the first, it was live, I had to go there, but the producer of the program was a bit worried I'd say something that would offend her many religious listeners. So she always wanted to see my script. And the first time I sent my script into her, she was horrified, not by the content, by the fact that I was giving a lecture for 5 minutes. And she said, no, she said, you've got to imagine this is 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, and you're talking to little old ladies sitting up in tea, drinking their tea, sitting in bed, drinking their tea. So she taught me a useful skill, and it's this. You start this homily, if you like, with a personal anecdote, something like, somebody asked me a question the other day that really knocked me off my feet. Then you continue the theme, and you maybe have a quotation from a humanist, and then you go into a sort of a so what, where am I going with this, and end up with a sort of call to arms, such as, when we think about it, maybe we should think about it in this sort of way. The religious people, of course, always end up with a prayer. I'm not going to talk about what to say in a lecture. You've got plenty of time. Well, I will just say a brief word about courses. Humanist UK set up 2 very good courses through the Future Learn system. One on humanist lives, which is rather more sort of personal interest, and one introducing humanism, which is a bit more philosophical. And I got to know them very well because I was the mentor for them for a couple of years. They've been taken off the internet now, but Humanist UK are revamping the Introducing Humanism, and I've seen a draft copy of it, and it's extremely good, better than the first one, which was very good, and it'll be coming out later this year. So what we might reintroduce in Shropshire Humanists is a group of people, maybe 10, 15 people, doing the course together. So they'd all sign on for the course, it's free, And each week they'd do maybe 2 hours going through the course online, and then we'd meet and for a couple of hours discuss it. And when we've done this in the past, and I think some of you may have done it, it was extremely popular. In fact, so popular that at the end of the course, people say, well, can we go on meeting and having discussions? And that's the beginning of our non-fiction book club. This is something a little different. Some pupils at Shrewsbury Public School, just up the road from here, they felt they were humanists and they started a humanist club and they asked me to come and speak. Now, I contacted the school because, in fact, they do have, it is a Christian foundation, but they said, no, that's fine. But I asked the RE teachers to come along. And to get a good turnout, I did a rather provocative title. And a lot of people turned up, including teachers, and they think they were expecting a sort of diatribe against religion. But in fact, they didn't get that. And what I said was, if somebody comes at you with a Bible, smile, be nice to them, change the subject, because they're not going to change what you think, and you're certainly not going to change what they think, because their belief is based on faith, and that doesn't require evidence or rational thinking. So stay out of arguments and stay friends. But if they come to you and say, look, I really would like a proper debate about existence of God or something like that, then you've got to have all your ducks lined up. So firstly, it's virtually impossible to prove a negative. So the onus is on them to produce the evidence. Ask for that evidence. And it's usually one of these 5 things. So you then have to know how to refute them. I wish I had time for that now, but I don't. Maybe we could do that sometime. Okay, so going back to talking to different groups. When you're talking to faith and interfaith groups, there's some terminology that needs sorting out. Firstly, the difference between belief and faith. Now, this is my take. I would say that to believe something is to say that you consider it to be true, and there's usually at least some evidence. To have faith in something is to say it's true with no significant evidence. And to have blind faith in something is to say something is true with evidence that it is untrue, evidence to the contrary. So an example of faith, having faith in the existence of God or the existence of an afterlife. To have blind faith would be the belief in maybe flat Earth or young Earth creationism. And then you've got shared values and different values. Don't start in by pointing out the differences between humanism and the religious person you're talking to. Try and find common ground. And in fact, there are many common grounds. This is just a list of, you'll recognize many of these. Virtually all religions believe in most of these. And I'll just pick out one because it's one of my favorites, being a father. Honor thy father and thy mother. Yeah, very important that. Let's just look at the Bible. Okay. So the first one is if you hit your dad or mum, you die. If you curse them, you die. If you're a stubborn, rebellious son, then his friends will stone you to death. That's a pretty uncompromising form of parental advice. And actually, if you look at the New Testament, it says, if you curse your father and mother, you should die. Now, I said this to my kids, and they said, bugger off, Dad, we're not Christian. Perhaps they should be. You also have to know the difference between a secular state and a secular society. There's a very good book by Andrew Copson. Now, a secular state is one where the government and the politics are separate from religion. And of course, they're not separate in our country because we have we have an established religion. A secular society is a society with no religion. Now, humanists don't want a secular society, but we definitely want state secularism because it helps everybody. It provides freedom for those who are non-religious from freedom. It also provides freedom for those with religion because everybody is on a level playing field. No particular preference for any particular religion or non-religious worldview. And then we have an interesting distinction between where we get our knowledge from, discovered truth and revealed truth. And I'll just go through this quite quickly. Humanists, like most people with a philosophical interest, consider there are two sources of knowledge. Axiomatic knowledge, truth. Basically, this is things like mathematics and propositional logic. Very interesting. But of course, what we're interested in is how we know about the world out there and us and the universe and everything. And that is based on discovered truth. Now, discovered truth works like this. If I want to know about something, I look at it, I study it, I observe it, I maybe do experiments, and that gives me an idea, a hypothesis, if you like. And then I look for things that agree with my hypothesis, but much more importantly, I look for things that disagree with it, make me abandon it, or at least tweak it so it's more likely to be correct. It's the constant testing and challenging of our ideas that's so important in what we call the scientific method. And this leads us to the philosophical position of naturalism, that we think everything in the world obeys natural laws and natural forces, and therefore we don't believe in the supernatural. Now, you might say this is all pretty obvious, because we see around the effect of science everywhere, not just the good, but the bad as well. But not all people rely on these two for their knowledge. Some people rely on what's called revealed truth, particularly sacred texts. And this is rather different because revealed knowledge, unlike science, is usually held to be absolutely true. And whereas knowledge from science changes, revealed truth tends to not change with time. And also, with the scientific method, it's the challenging of our ideas that's so important. With revealed truth, challenging isn't always welcome. There's also personal revelation. Religious people say that they have a voice from God that is informing them, helping them, comforting them. But in fact, these little unbidden thoughts that come to us occur to everybody. We get them as well, little ideas that come to us. But we think they come from our minds, our brains, rather than some ultimate source of truth out there. All right. So there's a big difference in revealed truth and discovered truth. Obviously, evolution and creationism. I believe in science rather than, oh, it's all a mystery. Critical thinking rather than, I know I'm right. Natural answers rather than supernatural understanding rather than prejudice. So another tip when you're talking to faith or interfaith groups, avoid saying, oh, it's just, and then give a scientific explanation. If somebody said to me, a rainbow is a beautiful thing and it's a manifestation of God's grace, all right? So don't say, no, it isn't. It's just refraction of light in droplets. Say, yeah, you know, when I look at a rainbow, I just feel deeply moved. My heart sort of feels lifted. And the fact that Isaac Newton showed it was due to refraction of light in raindrops many years ago makes it even more wonderful. If you just rubbish everything that's lovely in the world, by saying, oh, it's a scientific explanation, makes it seem very dull and uninspiring. On the whole, avoid certainty. Don't say there's definitely no God. I personally would say God is very unlikely as the evidence just doesn't add up. It's a rather nice book by Richard Dawkins where he discusses exactly this. Because in fact, when Isaac Newton did show the explanation for the rainbow, he was accused of diminishing people's religious ideas. Also, if you're talking in schools or with any group that's, shall we say, sensitive or vulnerable, I think certainty is to be avoided. For example, if somebody in a school said to me, oh, excuse me, sir, is there an afterlife? I would not say no. No, there's no afterlife. Because if I did, somebody's going to start crying and saying, what? You mean my granny is not in heaven? So I would say, well, I've looked at the evidence for an afterlife, and I personally don't think there is one. I can't be absolutely certain, but I don't think there is. But many people do. So I think you've got to be a little bit tactful in that respect. This is the famous humanist bus. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. There's probably no God. I love that. You compare that to the bus set up by the Christian Party. It's actually going past their office there. This is a very far-right Christian party. They say there definitely is a God. So I think that puts us in the better philosophical position. Okay. So common questions from those with faith. How do you know right from wrong and good and bad? Well, we'll come on to that in a moment. And also, anyway, even if you can work out what's right and wrong, why do you choose to do the right thing? And we'll come back to that. So this is basically normative ethics. Now, if I'm talking in a school and I've really got to keep it simple, so this is key stage 2, 7 to 11-year-olds, and I say to them, there was a time when everybody was religious. And people use their sacred books, interpreted by their priests, and revelation from God to tell them what was right and wrong. But humanists don't do that. We work it out for ourselves. I use evidence and careful thinking and kindness, maybe I explain empathy to them, to improve everybody's well-being and everybody's happiness. Our motto is think for yourself and act for everybody. And then, of course, they say, well, how do I work it out for myself? So I give them a simple example. Very simple, really. So a girl walking home from school, and she picks some flowers and she hands them to her mother. Her mother's delighted. She loves flowers, and the daughter's delighted because her mother's delighted. And I say to the pupils, if you think that's fine, point one way. If you think not quite right, point the other. If you're not sure, point up in the air. And sure enough, some point one way and some the other. And I say, okay, that's good. Because it's not an easy one, this. You have to think a bit about it. And before long, most of them have realized that they weren't her flowers, the girl's flowers for her to pick. If she'd picked them from a neighbour's garden, obviously wrong. And we discussed that a little bit. And then, and then I say to them, well, let me change it a little bit. Supposing the park was absolutely full of flowers and taking one or two made no difference. Well, what do you think then? At some point one way, some point the other. Some say, well, it was still stealing. I mean, she didn't rob a bank or anything, but it was still stealing. And then it isn't long before one bright kid says, but if everybody took flowers from the park, there'd be none left. That would be terrible, which is actually quite a sophisticated moral argument for somebody aged 7 to 11. So how do I tell grown-ups? Now, some of you may have come to my debate I had about where we get our moral values. I'm going to go through this very quickly. There's moral foundation theory, positive psychology, and normative ethics. Okay, so if you want to know about moral foundation theory, read this book by Jonathan Haidt. He showed that we have innate moral values, compassion and love, fairness and justice, respect for authority. You see all these in animals as well, leader of the pack and so on, in-group loyalty and taboos. So these are innate characteristics, innate moral values we're born with, but obviously they're influenced by our environment and particularly our upbringing. And then positive psychology. These scientists showed that if you question all cultures, all societies, and different sorts of people around the world, they all have very similar views about what are character strengths and virtues. We talked a bit about shared values already. I'm going to give you an example of how we might apply normative ethics. Okay, so a man breaks into a pharmacy and steals drugs. What do we think about that? Well, I mean, everybody's going to say, well, that's against the law and it's a bad thing to do, and we hope he'll be caught and we expect to be punished and hopefully rehabilitated. Everybody agrees about that. So then I change it a bit. Sorry. Um, he broke in because his wife is dying of cancer and the pharmacist is selling the anti-cancer drug that is only worth £20 for £2,000. This is just a story, okay? He steals the drug, leaves £40 for the drug, twice what it's worth, and he mends the window on the way out. Now, okay, he did wrong, but you slightly change your attitude about it, don't you? So let's think a little bit about how we feel. We feel compassion for the husband and his wife, of course. It's unfair to the wife and husband. It's also unfair to the pharmacist that he is broken into. And obviously, you can't have people just taking the law into their own hands. We all feel that as well. So these are our gut reactions. But now let's try and analyze it a bit using normative ethics. So, firstly, what is best for everyone? This is known as consequentialism. It is the utilitarian calculus that determines the action that produces the best outcome for the most people. And this goes back to Bentham and Stuart Mill. The pharmacist has a right not to be robbed. This is human rights, and again, Locke and Paine. If you don't want to be robbed, you shouldn't rob others. Well, that's called mutuality or the golden rule, which has been around for a very long time. In fact, the earliest record is in hieroglyphics 3,500 years ago, long before the main religions, who all claim it as their own. We should all obey the law. Now, I'm going to attribute this to Immanuel Kant, and he came up with two categorical imperatives. Now, you probably don't speak German, so I'll shorten it. The first categorical imperative, basically says, if everybody picked a bunch of flowers, okay, in other words, don't do things which if everybody did, if they were universalized, as he called it, it would be wrong. And this other imperative is, categorical imperative, is to treat others as an end, not as a means. And then you've got, were the thief's intentions good or bad? I mean, was he trying to do the right thing, help his wife, not make the pharmacist out of pocket? Or was he actually stealing drugs, bad drugs, narcotics to sell to children? So that is an area of ethics called virtue ethics, and it was first described by Aristotle and then revitalized in the last century by Elizabeth Anscombe. Now, it doesn't actually matter what you decide about the rights and wrongs of this particular pharmacy break-in. And it doesn't matter whether you can name labels to all these different thoughts, which I'm sure you recognized as valid. What's important is you realize that there was a complexity and the context affects the rights and wrongs. Thou shalt not steal is a very good start, but it's not exactly nuanced. It doesn't carry cover all the bases. So I've just explained that question. And then the next one, even if you can work out right and wrong, why do humanists choose to do the right thing? Well, religious people will say they do it because God has asked them to do it, or told them to do it, and they will get the approval of their community. And also they get preferential treatment in the afterlife. So why do humanists do the right thing? Well, we do the right thing because it's the right thing. Now, the two other main questions you get asked are, without religious spirituality, aren't humanist lives very dull and uninspiring? Without understanding God's purpose, how can humanists find meaning in life? Now, these are very important questions, and I'm not going to answer them. I just haven't got time. I'm thinking maybe of doing a talk later, including both of those. It's very interesting because as a sort of neuroscientist, I'm very interested in the parts of the brain and the mechanisms by which we have transcendental experiences without taking drugs. I'm going to say a few words about debate. If you're going to have a debate, choose somebody you like. And this was a very interesting debate. They disagreed, but they got on very well and isolated the areas of their disagreement. This is a terrible debate. It's online. It's just awful. It's by a Catholic cardinal in Australia and Richard Dawkins on Australian television. If you want to watch a debate that is brilliant, see this one. And all you need to do is go to YouTube and Google Catholic Church and Christopher Hitchens. It's absolutely brilliant and it's extremely funny. So when you've looked at it, give me a ring and we'll have a chat. So, debating creationism. And there is actually a museum of creationism in Oswestry. So don't even think about it. Why? Because you'll never win. And the reason you'll never win is that about halfway through the debate, the scientists leap up and down, start shouting, but that's not evidence. You can't say that. And because they lost their cool, they lost the debate. Now, I think you know me, I never take my own evidence. So I challenged a guy teaching creationism in Shrewsbury High Street, quite a well-known guy, to a debate about creationism because he said he could prove it scientifically. And that really irked me. So we agreed on several things. We agreed, firstly, that we would discuss not evolution, but the age of the universe and the age of the Earth. And these were my estimates, and those were his estimates, obviously very different. And then we had certain agreements about the rules of engagement, as it were. Firstly, you could only produce peer-reviewed scientific articles, scientific journals. All evidence had to be disclosed before the debate, like in a court of law. And the Bible was not an acceptable evidence, and the omphalos argument wasn't either. Now, you probably don't know what the omphalos argument is. It is the one argument for creationism that humanists, scientists cannot refute. And it goes like this. When God created the entire universe 6,000 years ago, he deliberately left evidence for an older universe to test our faith. This theory is also called Last Tuesdayism because it's just as likely that God created the entire universe last Tuesday and left evidence of a longer universe, including our memories. So what happened? I sent him my evidence about background radiation, light from distant stars, all those sort of things. And he sent me a whole lot of Creationist magazine articles. And he explained that he couldn't find any creationist articles that were peer-reviewed scientific journals because the trouble is the editors of these journals wouldn't publish their results of their research. So the debate was abandoned, and I explained to him that he was entirely up to him if he went on preaching creationism, but he couldn't say he could prove it scientifically. Whether he has or not, I'm not sure. This was a successful debate because it was run as a Platonic dialogue. So it was, evidence-based and rational. It was great fun. That's actually on YouTube somewhere. And then some of you may have come to this. This is when I and my next door neighbor, who's another fundamentalist Christian, debated where we get our moral values. In fact, it wasn't a debate. It was much more of a discussion, because before the debate, we showed each other what we were going to say in our opening speech. And then we sort of rewrote our own bits and showed them again. And we agreed that we would present our own views and the evidence for them, but we would not rubbish the other person's views. So we did this. He described how his moral values came from the Bible and his personal revelation with God. I described, normative ethics, moral foundation theory, and positive psychology. And then it was left open to the audience to ask questions of us, and so on. It wasn't a debate with a vote at the end, but obviously if there had been a vote, well. Now, this is a debate that my brother and I are going to organize. This is going to be a very adversarial debate, no holds barred, really vicious. But the unusual feature of this debate is that my brother will be talking on behalf of humanism, and I'll be talking on behalf of Christianity, and that should be fun. Now, if you've read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, you'll remember that he says people remember the best bits, the most important bits, and the last few bits. So at the end, I usually talk about spirituality, meaning of life, and then I show summary slides of the myths I've debunked, and I usually have a handout. So these are the common myths, and I hope by the end of the talk they don't think that most people are religious. They don't think that humanists are against religion. They don't think we want a secular society. They don't think we have no morals, no sense of the spiritual, no meaning or value of life. Only once have I had to defend humanism from being a cult. And it happened when my kids were in their teens. And I explained to my children that I was become a humanist, and I talked to them about the philosophical positions of normative ethics and naturalism. Unfortunately, they got muddled up between naturalism and naturism, and they were absolutely terrified that they'd have to go on nudist family holidays. But in fact, there's very little nudity in humanism, at least in Shropshire. And then they said, but Dad, it's a cult, okay? There'll be orgies and drugs, and they'll take all your money. Well, I'm very pleased to say that humanism has not taken all my money. As for the drugs and orgies, I'm still waiting.